The following program is video supplemental instruction. VSI is brought to you by the Teaching Center, UF's Learning Support Center, www.teachingcenter.ufl.edu.
Welcome to the LSAT Logic Games Introduction lesson. Today we're going to go over some of the foundation of the logic games. We're not going to actually do any of the practice themselves. We're just going to go over the general concepts of the logic games, the different types, the setups, how to attack them, so that you can get more familiar with what you're going to be facing when you take your LSAT logic game section. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the different types of games. These logic game sections have 4 games per section, and each game is going to be slightly different than the other. You don't ever know what types of games you're going to see, but you can know more or less the types of games that LSAT usually puts on the test. So the first type of game they usually that they have is the ordering game. This game is usually going to ask you to put some type of order together on your diagram. So whether it be time, from 8 a.m. to a certain time, or dates from Monday through Friday, or a specific numerical order from 1 to 5, from first to last. Ordering games are going to ask you to put your elements in a certain type of order. The second type of game are the grouping games. And these games are a little more complicated when you actually start diagramming them, because you have them in groups. Your elements are going to not be as simple as a 1-to-1 ratio, where on your diagram you're only going to have one element per row, per column. These games are going to ask you to have certain groups, and again, these concepts become a little more easy to understand once you actually start doing the games. It's a little complicated and kind of abstract, just me talking about it, but once we start actually doing some of the practice problems, it'll become a little easier to understand. The third type of game are combinations of both. These games will ask you to have a certain order, but it's going to also ask you to group as well. So like an example can be, maybe you have a Monday through Friday type order, where it's asking you to put something in an order of Monday through Friday. So Monday through Friday will be on your diagram, but then it might also say that within each day there's a morning and afternoon session, so that in each day there's going to be a certain group. There's going to be 2 elements at least per day. So that's an example of what a combination of both are. And a lot of times you see these type of questions on the LSAT. The fourth type is really obscure and ambiguous. It's the other section. There's no real name for it, because anything that doesn't fit into the ordering or grouping or both sections, they're complicated type games. They're games that they're not like each other in any way. They're just really obscure type games. They're really rare on the LSAT. You might not have any at all on the LSAT. If you do have any, you'll have 1 out of your 4 per section. And it's good to practice them, but at the same time you want to practice the grouping games and the ordering games a little bit more, just because you're more likely to see those. And the 5th section is the in and out games. These games, they're called in and out because they usually just involve, your diagram involves 2 columns, an in and an out, and you're literally plugging your elements in regards to whether they're in or whether they're out. This game usually falls under the grouping category, just because it's technically a grouping game, the 2 groups being the in group and the out group, but it has its own sort of different aspects to it. And again, all these type of games and all these concepts, they get easier to understand once you familiarize yourself through taking plenty of practice tests. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the setup. The setup is extremely important with the logic game section, because it's gonna direct your game. It's gonna direct how well you attack the game, how efficiently you use your time throughout the game. So the setup is crucial. And the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what is the game asking you? If you've seen an LSAT logic game before, you know that it has a premise in the form of a paragraph. It's giving you something to start off with, followed by certain set of rules, 3, 4, 5 rules, and then it gives you the questions themselves. Now this paragraph is always going to ask you something. Maybe not directly ask you, but it's going to imply that it's searching for something. It either wants something in a certain order, it either wants something in a certain group, it's either asking you to put a sets of runners in their starting order, or it's going to ask you to figure out, or it's going to ask you the starting times for certain movies. There's something that initial paragraph is going to want for you to solve, and you have to figure out what that is, because once you figure out what that is, you can figure out what goes on your diagram and the initial diagram setup, and what are your elements. And that flows into the second part of this, which is the inventory. These are basically your game ingredients, or your game pieces. Once you figure out what the game asks for, you can figure out what are going to be your elements, which are what you set off to the side. And these are the things that you're plugging in and out of your diagrams. These are the things that you're going to move around as you're playing the game. And what you're going to put on your initial diagram setup, which are the things that you don't move around. These are the kind of the independent variables that stay fixed on the diagram, and you don't mess with them throughout the game. The third part of the setup is the diagram. Once you figure out your game inventory, what the game is asking you for, you start setting up your diagram. And the actual setup of your diagram is really important, because depending on how you set it up, you can either make the game really easy on yourself, or you can make it really hard on yourself. This is basically your game board, where you're going to be working and doing all of the work throughout your logic game section. The fourth step of your setup is the clue symbols. Your as I said before, your game premise is going to have a paragraph followed by a certain set of rules. It's either going to be 3, 4, 5 rules, sometimes 6 rules, and these rules are in long sentence form, and the names of the elements are spelled out. They have full names, so it's a lot easier for you to just figure out a good way to symbolize each rule, so that when you have to look back on the rules during the game, you don't have to read a whole sentence. You can just look at a simple a clue that's usually no more than half an inch long, that expresses the entire rule, the entire sentence. And we're gonna practice some of these so you can see what we mean by this. But it really cuts your total time down by a lot. And your last step of your setup is to make actual deductions. Based on once you have your diagram, once you have your elements, once you have your clues, you can look at your game board, at your diagram and your rules without even starting the game, and make certain deductions. You can figure certain things out before ever starting the game, just based on the rules. And you're going to put those on your diagram as sort of a reminder, so that you know what certain rules are already there in the game. So if you know that a certain element can't go last, you're gonna put that on your diagram on the top, so that throughout the game it's there and it's really accessible and you see it right there, so you know that certain element can't go on that column. And again, this gets a little easier to understand as we start practicing more. Now, attacking the actual game. Once you have your diagram set up, you've figured out your elements, your clues, made your deductions, you still are not ready to start answering the questions. And this next step is probably one of the most important, because it makes the rest of the game so much easier for you. Your biggest enemy on the LSAT is time. If you had enough time, you could answer all the questions. They're not too difficult if you were to have an unlimited amount of time, but you don't. So to help you out with time efficiency, there's a certain way to answer the questions. What you want to do is you have to figure out what are the question types. There's certain types of questions on the LSAT that they ask, and you have to figure out what they are so that you can put them in the correct order. You're not going to answer the questions 1 through 5 or 1 through 6. You're going to answer them in the order that is the easiest, and you'll see why this works this way. The first, I'm going to read to you the types of questions, and they're also in the order that you should be answering them. So the first type of question is the plug a clue question. This type of question is going to ask you, it's going to have a complete and accurate, or it's going to ask you for a complete and accurate list of whatever the game is asking you for. So if the game's asking you for a list of performances at a given concert, it's going to give you a 5 complete list of whatever it say. You have 5 performances at a concert, and that's what the game is asking you for. It's going to give you the 5 artists, and you're going to have to figure out which one is the correct list according to the rules, which one fits with the rules. In other words, 4 out of the 5 are going to break some of the rule. And the reason it's called a plug a clue is because the way you answer this question is you use the rules and you plug them in. You go applying the rules down the list of the answer choices, and you knock off the answer choices that violate one of the rules, and eventually you're going to be left with one that is the correct answer. The reason this is the easiest is because you don't even have to use the diagram. Once you start doing this type of question, once you start practicing it more, it literally takes maybe 30 to 45 seconds, if that, because it's just a matter of knocking down the ones that obviously violate one of the rules until you have your correct answer. Your second type of question is called the instruction question. They're called the instruction question because they give you some type of instruction at the beginning. These questions will usually ask you to plug something in or place something somewhere. So it's going to say if artist A performs last, then and it'll ask you something. So it's going to tell you automatically, you know that artist A is going to be performing last for this question. And the trigger, the kind of clue, the trigger for this question is the word if. Usually, if the question begins with the word if, that's a dead giveaway that it's going to be an instruction question. And it's not always 100% going to be that way, but most of the time it is. And these type of questions have 4 types within them. They're all going to ask you to do something. They're all going to give you an instruction or clue, but then they're all going to ask you several different things. So the first type is the could be true. The second type is the could be false. The fourth type is the must be true, and the third type is the must be true, and the fourth type is the must be false. So it'll ask you if artist A performs last, then it could be true that, and you have to answer it, or it could be false that, or it must be true that, and you have to answer them in that question because that's that's the order in which they're easier or harder. The could be trues are always the easiest because when you're going down your answer choices and you're answering the question, the first one you find that could be true, automatically you have your answer. You don't have to keep looking for it. As opposed to the must be true, where if you go down the line and down your answer choices and you find one that could be true, that fits in your diagram, it doesn't necessarily mean that it must be true, because you could find a situation where that given premise doesn't have to fit that way. So this might be a little obscure now, but we'll work through some of the problems and you'll see how this works. So the third type are the broad questions. These type of questions, their trigger are usually the word which. Again, not always, but most of the time. When you see the word which as the beginning of the sentence, at the beginning of the sentence, then you're going to know that it's a broad question. The reason they're called broad questions is because unlike the instruction questions, they don't give you any type of clue. They don't give you any type of instruction. All they basically ask you is a very broad question. Which one of the following could be true? Which one of the following could be false? So they're a little harder than the first ones because you don't have anything initially to work off with. You don't have anything to start plugging in. You have to just start off with an empty diagram. And the fourth type are the variation questions. These are called variation because they usually give you something to change about the initial rules, the initial clues that you have. So it's either going to ask you to remove a clue or change a clue. So it's a variation on the rules that govern the game itself. For instance, it'll say, suppose the rule that A has to be last is changed so that A has to be first. Or suppose the rule that A has to be last is removed. And it'll ask you a question. The reason these are last is because they change the rules of the game, so you can't use any of the information you have set on your diagram to help you with that. And just to make you understand a little better why it's important to do it in this row, the instruction questions are really a lot easier than the broad questions because they give you those clues to begin with. So if you do the easy ones first, you're going to be done with them faster. But then an added advantage to that is that you've already worked out those easier ones on your diagram. So you're going to have information on your diagram that then you can use to help you answer the broad questions, as opposed to having to answer the broad questions first, and you might still answer them, and you're going to still have information there, but it's going to take you longer to do the broad questions and then have them help you out for the questions that you're going to get done fast anyways. So for instance, if you have three could be true questions, and you have a broad question that says, which of the following can't be true? You can look at your diagram that you've already made for all your instruction questions, and you can knock off the answer choices that you know based on the diagram could be true, can't be true. So it gets a little easier to understand. We're gonna do a couple of the practice problems so that you can see how it works. But this was something that I didn't like to do. I was always the type of person that wanted to get through the questions quickly. I didn't want extra steps. I felt like having to do another extra step after I've already set up the diagram, and got my elements and got my clues. Having to do another extra step would just make me lose time. But I started realizing that it actually really helps you a lot. You end up saving a lot more time in the long run. So I strongly recommend this setup for anyone out there. And then once you finish figuring out the question types and putting them in that order, then you're basically ready to start the game, and you start answering them in that order that you set them up in. So this is the conclusion of the LSAT Games introduction lesson. Be sure to check out our other practice videos on the several aspects of this, where we go more into detail into the specific portions of the setups of the questions themselves. And if anyone out there has any questions, you can email us at lsat180uf@gmail.com. Again, that's lsat180uf@gmail.com.
The Teaching Center, UF's Learning Support Center, www.teachingcenter.ufl.edu.